Hey guys, tonight we're entering a world of silence, stone, and simmering lentils. You're not just drifting off to sleep, you're trudging, barefoot and slightly grumpy, through the shadowed halls of a 12th century monastery, your wool robe scratchy, your stomach already unsure what's for dinner. The fire's low, the chapel bells have stopped, and somewhere down the corridor, a monk is probably snoring gently after his evening prayers. You came here to relax. But here's your first warning. You probably won't survive this place. Not because of the vow of silence or the 4 a.m. wake-up calls, but because of the food or the lack thereof. You're about to spend your nights nibbling watery porridge, sipping earthy beer, and pretending beaver tails count as fish. Your stomach may not thank you, but your soul... well, that's the idea. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing where you all are tuning in from. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You arrive at the monastery just after the final bell of the day compline. The sun has slipped below the hills, and the air smells like damp stone and ash. The brothers don't speak, but they nod in your direction. They've taken vows of silence, or at least partial ones. You, an outsider, are expected to watch, learn, and most of all, not complain. You're cold. You're hungry, but this is the life of a monk, structured, self-denying, and paradoxically full. Full of what, though? That's the question, because while the spiritual calendar bursts with rituals, readings, and prayers, the actual menu, it's less impressive. The Rule of Saint Benedict, basically the instruction manual for Western monastic life, lays it all out. Monks shall eat twice a day, and on most days, no meat of 4-footed animals is allowed. Sounds doable, right? But there's more. Fasting isn't just for Lent, it's a lifestyle. You're entering a space where every other day could mean smaller meals, plainer fare, or no meals at all. And yet, somehow, these men weren't starving in the strictest sense. They were surviving, often thriving just on a very different understanding of what it meant to eat. You follow the smell of soup into the refectory dining hall. It's long, narrow, and cold, lined with stone benches. The monks file in silently. A reader climbs up to a raised pulpit and begins reciting from the Psalms. The rest eat in silence, listening. No chatting, no chewing sounds allowed. A dropped spoon might earn a glare. Tonight, the meal is barley gruel. It's warm, thick like paste, and utterly unseasoned. A single piece of coarse bread sits on the wooden trenchers, and a half mug of weak ale is passed down the line. One monk sneezes quietly. Another bows his head and keeps eating. You bite into the bread. It's dry, very dry. Like, why is my mouth rejecting this dry? But this is the norm. Not every meal was quite so bleak, but for many medieval monks, food was fuel, not pleasure. Still, this wasn't about cruelty. Monks weren't trying to suffer for the sake of it. They believed that controlling the body helped free the mind, and that meant taming the belly, the so-called kitchen of sin. Hunger was a path to humility. A full stomach was a temptation, and yet loopholes. We'll get to those. Historians still argue whether early monks truly adhered to these strict rules, or if, over time, the daily grind bent even the holiest intentions. Some orders, like the Cistercians, were famously ascetic. Others, like the Benedictines, walked a middle path. By the 13th century, even stricter orders began forming to correct what they saw as overly comfortable monastic habits. You can almost hear the rivalry brewing. Your monks use spices. Spices? You glance over at the head of the table, the abbot. His plate seems a bit fuller than the rest. Is that cheese? Maybe even a fig. Hierarchy exists, even in holy places. Still, for the average brother, life was predictably bland. 2 meals a day in summer, 1 in winter, always simple, usually repetitive. Oatmeal, legumes, leeks, onions, the occasional fish, maybe a special treat on a feast day, but even that had to be earned. The strange thing is, after a few days, you begin to adjust. Your stomach stops growling quite so much. Your taste buds, once trained on spice and salt, start noticing subtleties. Was that lentil slightly smoky? Did someone put garlic in the stew? No? Just ash from the fire? Never mind. And every now and then, a moment of sensory grace hits you. A warm cup of ale after hours of silent prayer. The crunch of a turnip pulled from the garden. The tang of sourdough after weeks of hard bread. It's not abundance, it's appreciation. You start to feel what the monks must have felt. That food, when stripped of excess, becomes sacred. Every bite is a reminder of the body's limits and the soul's potential. Still hungry? Good, because tomorrow's a fast day. And that's when things get creative. The next morning begins in darkness, just as you were starting to feel cozy in your itchy straw mattress. A single bell clangs matins. It's somewhere between 2 and 4 a.m., and you drag yourself into the cold chapel like a very confused, very undercaffeinated zombie. The monks chant in Latin. You're too sleepy to comprehend the words, but the deep echoing voices do something strange to your bones, like someone humming into your soul. By the time the sun peeks through the mist, you've already prayed for 3 hours, weeded the herb garden, and hauled 2 buckets of water from the stream. You'd kill for a croissant. Instead, you get nothing, because today is a fasting day. Surprise! Fasting, in the monastic world, doesn't just mean skipping meals. It means deliberately denying comfort. Rougher bread, thinner soup, smaller portions. And here's the twist. They did this up to 200 days a year. That's more than half the calendar. Now, you might ask, who in their right mind signs up for that? Well, for a medieval monk, it wasn't just about virtue, it was about order. The church divided the year into ordinary time and sacred time. And sacred time, that meant food restrictions. Think Lent, Advent, Ember Days, vigils, and every Friday, just because. So if you're feeling peccasory, it's probably a vigil. But this isn't uniform across the board. Some monasteries fasted with steel-jawed commitment, consuming nothing from dawn to dusk. Others relaxed the rules slightly, offering small meals or liquid sustenance. Historians still debate whether the liquids included beer, milk, or even creamy soup. Let's just say medieval monks got very philosophical about what counted as eating. And speaking of soup, ever heard of potage? It's your new best friend. Imagine an eternal stew barley. Peas, kale, cabbage all simmered in a massive cauldron that never truly empties. Just add water and scraps each day, and presto, a perpetual meal. Quirky fact, some monasteries kept their potage simmering for months. Yes, months. One wrong ladle, and your bowl tastes like last December. Despite all this, the monks weren't starving skeletons shuffling through cloisters. They grew food, brewed beer, managed fisheries, and ran apiaries. They just didn't eat like kings sat, at least not in public. Behind cloistered doors, things got complicated. There were whispers of kitchen boys sneaking spices into broths, monks hoarding cheese, abbots requesting delicacies under the guise of medical need. One famous monastery reportedly received annual shipments of wine and eels, because obviously nothing says holy restraint like an eel cellar. And then there were fish loopholes. You've probably heard this one. Meat was forbidden, but fish was fine. So the monks got creative. Beavers counted as fish, thanks to their aquatic lifestyle and scaly tails. Puffins, fish. Barnacle geese, totally fish. The logic, they live in water. That's it. That's the loophole. Even today, Scholars argue about whether this was willful misinterpretation or genuine theological reasoning. Were monks gaming the system? Or did they truly believe God was okay with mammal-aquatic hybrids on fast days? Either way, it's clear. They were hungry, but they weren't stupid. You wander into the kitchen. A thin broth is bubbling. The cook, a stoic old monk with flour in his eyebrows, gestures for you to taste. You sip. It's hot water with hope. Maybe a turnip stub. Maybe a memory of onion. Your stomach cries quietly. By midday, you're lightheaded. But the monks, still working, still praying, still somehow functioning. Their bodies have adapted, their minds trained to rise above hunger. You, on the other hand, are fantasizing about roasted chicken with the intensity of a love poem. And here's something curious. Fasting days weren't necessarily miserable. They were rhythmic, predictable. They shaped life like tides. When to plant, when to harvest, when to butcher everything revolved around the spiritual calendar. And for monks, hunger became a kind of clock. The emptier the stomach, the closer to God. That's not to say everyone agreed. Some medieval theologians worried the extremes could backfire. Too much fasting, and monks grew weak, irritable, even delirious. Others believed the discomfort was the whole point. After all, Jesus fasted for 40 days in the desert. Surely you can survive on cabbage soup? Yet in practice, most monasteries adjusted for survival. A sick monk could be excused. Older brothers got more food. Traveling monks might be offered meat. The rules were strict, yes, but also strangely human. Flexible, quietly compassionate. And here's where it gets even more interesting. On feast days, holy celebrations scattered through the year, the table transformed. Out came fresh bread, dried fruits, fish pies, even wine. The same monks who spent all week gnawing barley suddenly feasted like minor nobility. It was a release valve, a reminder that joy wasn't forbidden, just scheduled. The contrast was intentional. Joy meant more after sacrifice. Flavor hit harder after blandness. A single fig on Easter Sunday could feel like divine ambrosia. You end the day in the same refectory, the same long bench, the same stone silence. Tonight's dinner is half a turnip and a small bowl of that eternal potage. The reader is reciting a passage from Ecclesiastes, something about vanity and dust. You chew slowly. There's no spice, no thrill. Just warmth, weight, and the bare minimum needed to keep you alive. And strangely, you feel okay. Not full, but not frantic either. Just light, quiet. Like something in you is softening, emptying, making room for stillness. That, right there, is the curious diet of fasting monks. Your stomach grumbles like a distant thunderstorm as the faint light of early morning creeps over the cloister wall. But today, something's different. Today is not a fast day. It's what the monks call a feria, or our regular weekday when meals are permitted. You shuffle eagerly into the refectory, eyes scanning for the slightest hint of indulgence. And lo and behold, your breakfast awaits. A hunk of coarse brown bread and a steaming cup of weak ale. Yep, breakfast beer for ya. Welcome to medieval monastic life. Beer called small ale when brewed light wasn't just a treat, it was a necessity. Water wasn't always safe, and a weak brew could keep you hydrated and spiritually upright. Not exactly a cold IPA, but hey, it doesn't taste like pond. And if you're wondering, no, the monks didn't exactly get buzzed at morning prayers. Most of the alcohol boiled off during brewing. Mostly. Your bread, on the other hand, is like chewing on guilt. Dense, sour, no butter, no jam. But here's the kicker. That bread is your lifeline. Rich in calories, rough on the teeth, and surprisingly symbolic. Bread was more than food, it was a metaphor. Give us this day our daily bread, remember. In some monasteries, monks received a daily bread ration, meticulously weighed and recorded. At Cluny, you'd get about a pound of bread a day. In harsher orders like the Carthusians, much less. Historians still debate how those rations shifted during lean harvest years. Some say they stayed the same God provides. Others argue that monks quietly adjusted, rationing among themselves or leaning harder into legumes. Ah, yes, the humble legume, lentils, peas, fava beans, a monk's best friends. Not flashy, but full of protein and bonusiasi to grow. Entire monastic gardens were laid out with these in mind. You might even stumble upon a cheerful little plot of garlic or onions if you're lucky, though technically those were often discouraged. Why? Because they inflame the passions, of course. Can't have monks getting too frisky from a spring onion. By midday, it's time for the main meal, usually the largest of the day, often served in silence while one monk reads aloud from scripture. You sit on a hard bench, shoulders sore, knees bruised, stomach hopeful. A bowl of lentil porridge arrives. Not glamorous, but it's warm and earthy, and there's a comforting familiarity to it, like being hugged by a beige vegetable. And here's the funny thing. Despite all the rules, monks were serious foodies in their own way. They just disguised it with holiness. Manuscripts survive with entire recipe collections show to make almond milk, how to flavor fish without meat, how to bake soul cakes for All Saints' Day. These weren't lazy slop bowls. They were culinary puzzles. How do you make a dish taste good without breaking a single rule? That's how almond milk became a monastic staple. No cows on a fast day? No problem. Soak some almonds, grind them into a paste, and mix with water. While a milky texture, no sin. Monasteries with wealthy patrons could afford almonds in bulk. Poorer ones, they got creative with peas. But not everything was grey mush. Monks cultivated herbs for both healing and flavor: sage, mint, parsley, hyssop. In fact, you're probably standing near a carefully tended physic garden right now, full of fragrant green magic. Just don't try to sneak a taste. The herbalist monk is very protective. Once, he caught a novice chewing a basil leaf and assigned him 3 days of silence and extra dung hauling. Now here's a fun little secret. Some monks became famous for their food. In southern France, the Abbey of Saint Gall had a kitchen so respected. Other monasteries wrote to them for culinary advice. How do you keep your turnips from tasting like socks? That sort of thing. And yes, monks wrote back with recipes and diagrams. And let's not forget fish ponds. Oh yes, every decent medieval monastery had its own fish pond. Some had several. Stocked with carp, pike, and perch, these weren't just spiritual loopholes, they were gourmet gardens. Monks learned to breed, net, and prepare fish in ways that made fast days almost festive. Fried eel, baked trout, stewed perch with herbs. Not every day, of course, but often enough to keep the fasting blues at bay. One record even suggests monks bred mute swans in captivity for feast days. And since swans were technically wildfowl, they qualified under certain rules. That's some legal gymnastics right there. Historians still argue whether the church knew and ignored these culinary pirouettes, or whether the monks just got very, very good at semantics. By supper taken in the early evening, your meal is lighter. Maybe another hunk of bread, maybe some broth, occasionally a bit of dried fruit or cheese, if it's a feast day's eve. You eat in silence again, which, let's be honest, makes chewing awkward. Nothing like the echo of 14 monks slurping soup in unison to make you rethink your life. And yet you're settling in. You start to notice the routine, the rhythm. Hunger comes and goes like a tide. Meals are grounding, not thrilling. Simple, but not joyless. There's an elegance in the austerity, and beneath the silence, there's something else. Intention. Every bite is part of something bigger. A rule. A rhythm. A way of living that says, we need just enough. And just enough starts to feel like plenty. You wake in the middle of the night, wrapped in the heavy silence of stone walls and straw-filled mattresses. The monastery sleeps, but your stomach whispers, is that all there was? You shift under your rough wool blanket, dreaming of roasted chickens that never cluck and pies that never exist. But don't feel too bad. You're not alone in your nightly cravings. In fact, the whole church had a bit of a loophole obsession. Let's talk about one of the weirdest culinary acrobatics in monastic history. How monks learned to feast by fasting. See, here's the thing. Fasting didn't mean eating nothing, it meant following very specific rules. No meat from land animals, no dairy, unless you had a papal permission slip, no eggs, unless they came from a loophole disguised as a feathered technicality. But fish were the golden ticket. And waterfowl, even better. Why? Because the church classified them not as meat, but as cold-blooded, which means a plump, roasted beaver tail was totally fine on a Friday. You heard that right, beaver. Monks in France considered it a fish. Historians still argue whether this was a genuine theological debate or just wishful chewing. You shuffle to the kitchen one cold morning and Brother Martin is already there. He's gutting something long and slimy. "It's lamprey," he says, like that should reassure you. This wriggly eel-like creature is a monastic favorite. Rich, fatty, and most importantly permissible on fast days. Cooked right, it tastes like smoky butter and looks like something from a Renaissance horror film. And yes, monks ate a lot of lamprey, so much in fact that noble monasteries would send their cooks to compete in lamprey preparation contests. Brother Giles' stuffed lamprey with almond sauce was one so popular it appeared in 3 separate manuscripts. There were also arguments fierce. Scholarly arguments over whether barnacle geese, which were believed to grow from driftwood or sea foam, counted as seafood. Because hey, if it grows in the ocean, it's fish, right? This is how you end up with monks sitting in libraries, earnestly debating whether an otter is spiritually closer to a trout or a pig. But beyond the absurdity, there's a deeper current. These weren't just loopholes for gluttony. They were sincere efforts to obey rules while nourishing frail human bodies. Monks were expected to labor, pray, and read for hours each day. Fasting couldn't mean starvation. It meant discipline, with just enough creative interpretation to stay alive and maybe enjoy the occasional grilled swan leg. You trudge to the dining hall for your fast day meal, where everything smells quiet. That's the only word for it. The food doesn't sizzle. It simmers. A bowl of millet porridge, maybe. A spoonful of stewed kale. No salt pork. No butter. But then a treat appears. Pears poached in wine, spiced with cloves. It's surprisingly elegant. Turns out, monks knew how to elevate the humble. They learned from herbs, textures, even temperature. Cold beet soup in summer. Hot apple mash in winter. The rule of Saint Benedict, which governed many monastic orders, didn't prescribe specific foods, but it did emphasize moderation. Let all things be done with measure, it says. That didn't stop monks from finding very generous measures of fish on feast days. A 14th century monastery in England recorded serving 57 different kinds of fish over the course of a year. That's not a meal plan, it's a seafood tour. Still, there were limits. Even creative monks had to keep up appearances. Some orders, like the strict Carthusians, forbade elaborate meals, seasoning, or second helpings. Others, like the more relaxed Cluniacs, embraced culinary excellence as a form of worship. Their logic? If you can sing to God beautifully, why not cook beautifully too? Of course, not all monks agreed. One Cistercian abbot reportedly scolded his kitchen staff for turning the refectory into a palace. Another claimed that a monk who eats like a king cannot pray like a saint. It's the eternal tension how to balance body and spirit, appetite and asceticism, and it never really gets resolved. Even today, historians still debate whether medieval monks were truly self-denying or just liturgically sneaky. Let's not forget the role of social class. Wealthy abbés had the means to buy spices, import dried fish, and grow rare herbs. Poorer monasteries? They made do with turnips and Did we mention turnips? There are entire litanies of complaints written by monks about the tyranny of root vegetables. "O Lord, spare me from the tastelessness of thy humble tubers," wrote one anonymous scribe. Probably in February. Still, even in the humblest monasteries, monks found ways to create joy through food. On major feast days, Christmas, Easter, St. Benedict's Day, rules relaxed. Meat might be allowed. Cheese appeared like a heavenly visitor. Honey was stirred into oat cakes. Bells rang. Candles flickered. You were allowed to enjoy your meal, not just endure it. Imagine that. One roasted goose a year, and it's enough to make the whole room weep. You're probably wondering, did the monks ever cheat? Did they ever sneak snacks after compline, the final prayer of the evening? Well, officially, no. But unofficially, let's just say a lot of monastic kitchens had hidden nooks. One medieval rulebook even included a warning. Let no brother leave crusts in his sleeves. That means someone definitely tried. There's even a perhaps apocryphal of a monk who kept a sausage hidden in a hollowed-out Bible. The abbot discovered it when the pages started to smell. Moral of the story: God sees everything, and sausage isn't exactly the word made flesh. Still, those moments, those subtle rebellions add texture to the story. Monks weren't saints. They were men trying to live as saints. And living as a saint, it turns out, involves a lot of boiled leeks and the occasional smoked herring behind a tapestry. You head to bed with a belly full of lentils and a mind full of loopholes. The walls whisper centuries of silent meals, of whispered debates over duck eggs, of fish so fancy they wore sauces like velvet robes. And somewhere in the dark, a sleepy monk mutters in Latin, probably dreaming about lamprey again. You awaken to the soft creaking of wooden floorboards and the faint chiming of a distant bell. Another day of prayer, labor, and yes, eating, though eating here doesn't mean what you wish it did. This morning, we're peeking into what you might call the monk's medieval food calendar, the sacred rhythm of feasting and fasting that governed every forkful, spoonful, and crumb. Here's where things get interesting. Monks didn't just fast during Lent. No. That would be far too simple. You're looking at nearly 200 fasting days a year. That's over half your calendar dotted with the word abstain. And yet, within this strict framework, there was a kind of culinary dancing, intricate system of rotating menus, seasonal ingredients, and regional flair. Let's start with the basics. Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays were typically fish or vegetarian days. Saturdays were a bit looser, unless a feast day fell nearby. Sundays? Glorious Sundays. Meat might appear, but only for those with a medical notia, the abbot's permission. And Lent? Lent was the Everest. Not only did you give up meat, dairy, and eggs, but in some communities, you even skipped the midday meal entirely. But here's the twist. Fasting didn't always mean eating less. Sometimes it meant eating differently. So instead of your usual barley bread and cheese, you might get warm almond milk and a loaf baked with peas. It was still food, but food transformed, altered to fit the fast. And that brings us to your favorite concept, the collation. After Vespers, monks were usually allowed a small snack, maybe a few ounces of bread and some watered wine. It was originally a time for reading collations, spiritual texts, to close the day. But somehow, the word got attached to this tiny twilight meal. It's like calling your midnight snack evening motivational literature. Quirky, right? Now, picture this. It's Advent. Snow flurries kiss the narrow windows. The hearth is low. You sit beside Brother Thomas, both of you hunched over steaming balls of leek and onion pottage. It's simple, sure, but it smells earthy and warm. A drizzle of oil, a pinch of rosemary. For dessert, a poached quince, Not bad for a season of supposed deprivation. Medieval monks were experts at seasonal eating, not because they were trendy but because they had to be. Strawberries only existed in May. Apples were cellared carefully for winter. Root vegetables were your constant companions. You develop a profound relationship with beets. A spiritual bond, even. And then, the feast days. The bright jewels scattered through the gray. On these days, the rules bent. Roasted capon, spiced wine, maybe even cheese cloaked in herbs. Feasts meant joy, celebration, gratitude. But they also required planning. Monks kept calendars that were both spiritual and gastronomical. A Benedictine abbey might have scheduled a dozen major feasts and 40 minor ones. Think of them as medieval flavor holidays. But don't get too excited. The line between feast and fast could blur. For instance, the feast of Saint Mary Magdalene might fall during a fasting period. So, yes, it's a celebration, but with fish stew and almond cakes instead of roast venison. Monks became incredibly adept at turning fasting food into celebratory fare. Some dishes were so good that future generations mistook them for indulgences. But nope, just a creative fish mouse. Now let's zoom in on a single week at a well-fed monastery, say, the Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland. Monday, cold barley salad with mint, smoked trout, and pear broth. Tuesday, lentil cakes with dill, turnip greens, and honeyed oats. Wednesday, pumpkin mash, crusty rye bread, and fig syrup. By the time you reach Saturday, you're having fried eel with garlic butter, dried cherries, and a cup of herb-infused ale. If you're imagining a medieval Michelin star menu, you're not wrong. Still, this balance was fragile. One bad harvest, one rough winter. The fasting got very real, very fast. Historical records from the 13th century show a monastery in Germany surviving on little more than cabbage water for 3 months straight. Not because they wanted to, because they had to. Monks also didn't all eat the same. The refectorium, their dining hall, might see dozens, but the meals varied based on health, age, or even role. The infirmary kitchen served softer foods, think mashed peas and warm milk porridge. Elders were given more frequent meals. Novices, less so. And don't forget the lay brothers, who did the heavy labor. They got bigger portions, including meat on special occasions. Physical strength trumped spiritual symbolism, at least in terms of protein. Now, here's a juicy debate. Did monks ever manipulate their food calendars to sneak in extra feasting? Some scholars think so. There's evidence that certain abbeys reinterpreted the meaning of minor saints' days, conveniently labeling them as major feasts. Suddenly, Brother Crispin's obscure relic from the Balkans is cause for roast duck. Coincidence? Historians still argue whether this was genuine piety or a clever excuse to fry more fish. Either way, it reveals something quietly lovely. Monks didn't just eat alive, they lived within their food, as an extension of time, rhythm, and sacred order. One monk wrote in the margin of a manuscript, "Fasting purifies the soul. Feasting reminds it of joy." It's that delicate seesaw to experiences, both holy, both necessary. Like the inhale and exhale of a faithful life. You push your wooden bowl away. The porridge is gone, but its warmth lingers in your belly. You hear the bell again compline. Time to sleep. The candles are low. The refectory echoes with silence. You think about tomorrow's menu, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing that fasting or no, you'll eat something made with care, with purpose, with a kind of sacred flavor that lives only in places where time slows down. The moon slips behind a cloud as you shift gently under your blanket of coarse wool. It's the dead of night at the abbey, and all is silent except for the slow, rhythmic breath of your fellow monks. But not everyone is asleep. Somewhere in the dark, Brother Matthew is awake, tiptoeing past the cloister garden toward the back of the kitchens. No, he's not stealing bread. He's tending to the secret heart of monastic cuisine, the preparation of fasting food that doesn't feel like fasting food. Welcome to the wonderfully slippery world of monastic loophole cooking. See, monks were bound by Rulessimattime's many rules, but they were also, let's say, spiritually clever. When the rule of Saint Benedict said no meat, it was clear. But what counts as meat? That's where the debate began. Fish? Clearly allowed. Frogs? Technically amphibians. Beavers? Here's where it gets chewy. Since beavers spend most of their time in water and have scaly tails, some monks argued they counted as fish, which means you could roast a beaver tail on a Friday and still be in full compliance. That's some great theological gymnastic right there. Historians still argue whether the beaver loophole was widely accepted or just a regional oddity. But there's no doubt that monks were masters of pushing the fasting envelope without breaking it. They created entire genres of food eggless custards, cheese-free lasagna, mock sausages from mushrooms, and oats, all designed to satisfy the rule in the stomach. Take the classic Lenten almond cheese. No cows involved. Just ground almonds, water, and a bit of vinegar, pressed and salted until it resembled a soft, creamy wheel. If you didn't look too closely, you might think it was goat cheese. Close enough for Lent. Or their faux butters made from crushed nuts and herbs. Spread that on rye toast, and you're suddenly not suffering all that much. You might even look forward to Fridays. But not every monk approved. There were plenty of cranky scribes who left behind marginal notes about these culinary sleights of hand. Let the brothers not deceive the Lord with pies of false cheese, one wrote. Another denounced clever dishes that pretend to be holy. Yikes. Still, creativity thrived. In northern France, some monasteries built dedicated fasting kitchens, where only non-meat items were allowed. Over time, these kitchens became the incubators of plant-based innovation. Want a sausage but can't have pork? How about one made of ground lentils, sage, breadcrumbs, and mushroom stock, wrapped in a cabbage leaf and lightly roasted? Not bad, Brother Michelin. Not bad at all. Let's not forget desserts, because monks had serious sweet teeth, even in the fasting seasons. No eggs, no butter, they whipped up pear tarts using olive oil crusts, poached figs drizzled with honey, and rice pudding made with almond milk and rosewater. You can imagine the collective gasp when that first rosewater panna cotta hit the table. Suddenly, Lent didn't feel like a punishment. And while we're here, meet the star of the monastic fasting table. The humble pea. Dried peas were filling, packed with protein, and mercifully keep-bought. They appeared in everything. Soups, stews, pastes, pancakes. Toss in leeks, onions, or garlic, and you had a proper belly warmer. One monk supposedly claimed, "A day begun with peas shall never end in sin." That's either devotion or digestion talking. And don't underestimate the power of spices. Cloves, cinnamon, black pepperies. They were expensive, but not off-limits. Some monasteries grew their own herbs or received spice tithes from patrons. A pinch of clove in your lentil mash could make it feel less penitential and more like a medieval Michelin experience. Now here's a delightfully quirky tidbit. In one 12th century monastery, the cooks created feast illusion plates, a kind of edible trompe l'oeil. Picture a fish-shaped mold filled with spiced barley paste, colored with herbs and baked until golden. From a distance, it looked like roasted trout. Up close, more like sculpted oatmeal. But it fooled the eye and satisfied the rule. This brings us to the philosophy behind it all. Why go to such trouble to fake meat or recreate cheese? Why not just suffer through the fast as intended? Because monks weren't trying to punish themselves, they were trying to stay connected. To God, yes, but also to community, to memory, To the sensory world they'd sworn to live in humbly. Food, even fasting food, was a shared experience. The preparation was part of the ritual. Grinding the almonds, steeping the herbs, forming little patties by candlelight, it was meditative, sacred, slow. Your hands, your nose, your tongue, they were all part of the prayer. Of course, there were scandals. At least one abbey was chastised for overstepping the fast too boldly. A bishop's inspection found stuffed pasties filled with forbidden meats, cleverly tucked beneath lentil sauce. Another was caught flavoring broth with beef bones for the infirm, except the whole refectory had miraculously become ill. Still, it wasn't just about bending rules. These dishes were expressions of care for the community, for tradition, for the body and soul surviving together. A monk might spend 3 hours crafting a fasting day stew, not because he was bored, but because every spoonful was meant to nourish faith. And that's the paradox you slowly start to understand. The more restricted the diet, the more creative the response. Hunger didn't dull imagination, it sharpened it. A life bound by ritual didn't shrink invention, it gave it shape, a frame in which beauty could emerge. You roll over, smiling. Maybe you'll ask for more pea pancakes tomorrow, or see if the infirmary has any of that rose pudding left. Just for spiritual reasons. You awake before the bells, the faint gray of dawn slipping past the shutter slats. Your stomach gives a soft groan. Last night's barley porridge didn't quite do the trick and your thoughts wander to breakfast. But as you stretch and hear Brother Simon's soft snore, you remember. There's no breakfast, as you know it. Not here. Not now. Because the rules don't just govern what you eat, they dictate when you eat too. Today, like so many others, you'll be practicing what medieval monks called collation. It's a fancy word with a hungry meaning. No solid food until mid-afternoon. And even then, it's only one modest meal, followed by a light snack if you're lucky. This is not just intermittent fasting, it's institutionalized hunger. Now, to be fair, not every monk lived like this every day. The strictest rules applied during fasting seasons like Lent or Advent. But even outside those times, the rule of Saint Benedict recommended eating only once or twice daily. The idea was simple. The less you fed the body, the more you fed the spirit. Historians still argue whether these one-meal days were rigidly observed or more idealized in the texts than in practice. Some suggest that many monasteries quietly stretched the rules, shifting meal times or inserting a light repast under the guise of a medicinal need. But back to you, trudging through the morning prayers with a belly that echoes like a church bell. As the hours wear on, the anticipation for the midday meal grows almost holy in itself. And when the time finally arrives, usually around the 9th hour, or 3 p.m., you and the others shuffle into the refectory with a kind of reverent hunger. The scene is quiet. No talking aloud. Just the soft scrape of wooden spoons in bowls and the gentle thud of bread against trenchers. A lector reads aloud from the Gospels while you eat. You pretend to listen, but mostly, you're focused on your turnip stew. Now, here's the twist. For all their austerity, monastic meals were surprisingly structured, even organized. You don't just get handed whatever was left in the pantry. Meals were planned with care and divided among roles. Younger monks, often doing more physical labor, got slightly larger portions. Sick monks might receive eggs, milk, or even meat, if deemed necessary. Quirky tidbit. At Cluny Abbey in France, records show that the cooks made such precise charts of each monk's dietary needs that it resembled an early form of a medieval nutritionist's spreadsheet. Brother Arnold has bad digestion? No onions for him. Brother Paul has a weak constitution? Extra broth. In an age of limited medical understanding, Food was the first line of both treatment and prevention. But even the healthiest monk needed to power through long hours on minimal sustenance. A typical Lenten meal might include a slice of dark rye bread, a ladle of cabbage and bean pottage, and if the day was especially generous, a poached pear soaked in wine and herbs. Still hungry? Too bad. The next real meal is tomorrow. But withers the collation, that elusive snack mentioned earlier. After evening prayers, monks might be permitted a small drink, think weak ale or thin wine, and perhaps a bite of bread. Not enough to fill you, but just enough to calm the stomach before a long night of sleep and silence. Over time, this idea of the collation grew legs, literally. By the late Middle Ages, some monasteries transformed it into a more substantial light supper. Cheese appeared, maybe a boiled egg, occasionally even pastries. This quiet evolution of the rules is something scholars love to bicker over. Was it decadence creeping in? Or just a practical adaptation to human needs? And here's where things get weirder. Some monks, especially in wealthy monasteries, created an unofficial system of secret snacks. Fruit preserved in honey, a sliver of almond cake, maybe even a sausage, accidentally left near the bread oven. It was rarely spoken of, but everyone knew. Brother Thomas always had crumbs on his robe. Brother Elias somehow never looked hungry. Coincidence? There were, of course, consequences. Abbots periodically cracked down on unauthorized collation, citing gluttony and spiritual sloth. One famous case from a German monastery in the 14th century involved 3 monks caught hoarding dried figs in their cell. Their punishment? 40 days of nothing but boiled nettles and water. Ouch. But the hunger wasn't just physical. It had a psychological dimension. Constant low-grade emptiness kept you grounded, kept you humble. It reminded you of mortality, of simplicity, of your vow of poverty. You didn't need to feast to feel satisfied. You needed to detach from the feast altogether. That's the theory, anyway. In practice, monks got inventive. During fasting periods, some began to experiment with meal pacing. One cheeky trick was to prolong the eating process. Cut bread into tiny cubes, chew slowly, sip broth between bites. You could turn a 10-minute meal into a 40-minute meditation. Was it loophole abuse? Maybe, but it also turned dinner into a kind of slow, sacred ritual. And sometimes hunger became communal. Monks might trade part of their portion with another, creating small networks of generosity. Brother Leo hates lentils. Brother Ambrose will trade you for his cabbage. Silent bartering under the watchful eye of the lectorate was the most medieval kind of cafeteria diplomacy. As you finish your meal still hungry, always hungry, you feel that strange blend of exhaustion and clarity. You're lighter, not just in body, but in mind. The hunger is part of you now, not a torment but a tether. You walk back to your cell, stomach humming, already anticipating tomorrow. Not the food, the ritual, the rhythm, the restraint died. You wake up groggy, head still fogged from the hunger that never quite lifts. The bell tolls again, its rhythm as constant as your stomach's quiet complaints. Another fasting day, but this one's different. This one's Friday. And in the medieval monastic world, Friday isn't just the start of the weekend, it's a day steeped in sacrifice, discipline, and some of the most extreme food laws you'll ever encounter. Because today you eat like Christ suffered. Or at least, that's the theological idea. You deny the body to uplift the soul. No meat, no dairy, no eggs, not even fish in the stricter orders. You're left with plants, water, and the occasional grain if the abbot's in a good mood. It's like a spiritual detox minus the Instagram smoothie bowl. But here's the thing. The monks fasted so often they had to get creative. Like, really creative. And that's how today, in your little refectory, you find yourself chewing something that might be eel, but isn't. It's not fish either. It's a curious medieval workaround made from almonds, spices, and yes, bread paste. It's meant to mimic the texture of meat. Welcome to the glorious loophole of mock food. Because if the letter of the rule says no meat, but doesn't mention imitation meat, then guess what's suddenly on the menu? Fake flesh, as it was sometimes called, became a whole cottage industry inside the cloister. Monks experimented with pounded nuts, soaked legumes, and dried fruits to make meat-adjacent meals. Some records even describe faux roast goose made entirely of wheat and mushrooms, molded and baked until the skin crisped up just right. Historians still argue whether this was a sincere attempt to stay spiritually compliant or just culinary sneakiness wearing a habit. Were these monks cheating or just surviving with a side of style? One famous case comes from a Benedictine priory in 13th century England, where the cook created an eggless custard using almond milk, honey, and ground rice. The brothers praised it as divinely comforting, though no one was fooled. Still, the abbot turned a blind eye. After all, everyone was technically following the rule, and this wasn't just limited to faux meats. Lent brought an explosion of fake cheese, a pungent mash of crushed pine nuts or soaked oats. Monks would shape it into rounds, salt it, and age it in cellars to develop a funk that would put some modern camembert to shame. The result was questionable. But after 30 days of turnips, even questionable cheese starts tasting miraculous. On really special days, the kitchen might unveil fish-shaped pies, made entirely of root vegetables and cleverly scored to look like scaled skin. It's like medieval edible cosplay. You'd stare at your trenchers thinking, is this a sin or just dinner? Meanwhile, the concept of fasting got even murkier when you throw in geography. In some regions, beavers were declared fish by church authorities because they lived in water. You can guess where that went. Suddenly, roasted beaver tail made appearances at Lenten feasts. Tastes like fatty fish, they said. Justifiable, the bishop said. Suspicious, said pretty much everyone else. And here's a juicy one. In colder climates, where survival meant calories, the rules bent like soft cheese. In some Scandinavian monasteries, monks quietly kept hens not for meat, of course, but for their eggs, which somehow kept appearing in Lenten bread. The explanation? Medicinal necessity. That phrase covers a multitude of delicious sins. But don't get the wrong idea. Not all monks were culinary rebels. Many truly embraced the fasting disciplines with stoic dedication. Take the Carthusians, for example. These guys made the Benedictines look like brunch-loving bloggers. No meat, ever, even outside Lent. Strict silence during meals, and absolutely no spicy foods because spices, they believed, inflamed the passions. And what's more, even plant-based meals were kept deliberately bland. Salt? Minimal? Oil? Maybe a drop. The idea wasn't just to avoid indulgency, it was to eliminate pleasure. If a bite of boiled cabbage brought you joy, you were probably doing it wrong. Still, the human palate is hard to suppress. Even when eating cabbage for the 12th day in a row, monks would whisper tips. Add a bit of vinegar, let it sit longer, stir 3 times. Tiny rebellions of flavor. One French manuscript even contains what scholars believe is a monk's secret recipe for Lenten stew, complex mix of leeks, herbs, stale bread, and crushed nuts, boiled together until it thickened like gravy. Was it divine inspiration, or just a monk really tired of blandness? You may laugh, but flavor was serious business, because when you can't eat much, how you eat becomes spiritual theater. Monks didn't just consume food, they meditated on it, ritualized it. The texture, the smell, the humble origins of each bite were reflections of Christ's suffering. Eating wasn't about taste. It was about testimony. And yet, despite the best intentions, sometimes the rule book clashed with reality. On particularly harsh days, bitter wind, aching bones, coughs spreading through the dormitory, abbot might quietly allow a bowl of warm broth at an odd hour. Nothing rich, just hot water, maybe a wilted leaf or two. Still, it felt like a feast. Compassion, it turns out, was stronger than regulation. So, as you spoon another helping of almond mush into your mouth, you reflect on the quiet contradiction. Monks who denied themselves everything and still found ways to indulge. Within limits, of course. But it turns out, limits are elastic, especially when your pantry is filled with dried herbs and your imagination is steeped in scripture. You finish your meal with a hiccup of thanks. You're still hungry. Always hungry. But tonight, you've tasted the strange wisdom of holy hunger that even in denial, there is creativity. Even in abstinence, joy sneaks in almond-shaped and oddly chewy. The afternoon sun filters softly through the stained glass, painting the stone floor with gentle hues of red and blue. You settle into your wooden bench, the weight of the day's discipline pressing lightly on your shoulders. Now, it's time for the simple, repetitive work that fills the monks' hours, the endless cycles of prayer, copying manuscripts, and tending the garden. But beneath the quiet piety, food and fasting linger in every action, shaping rhythms and routines with a subtle, insistent presence. Because in this monastic life, fasting isn't just about food. It's about structure, about creating order in the chaos of existence. Your daily schedule prayers at dawn, mid-morning, midday, afternoon, evening, and night air, all carefully spaced around meals and fasts. Each fasted day carves out moments of hunger and longing that sharpen your mind, even as your stomach grumbles. Historians still argue whether this strict routine was truly spiritual discipline, or simply a clever way to control a community of hundreds who might otherwise riot over food scarcity. Either way, the system worked, and the monks thrived in their ordered world. Take the liturgy of the hours, for example. Every prayer session punctuates the day with a spiritual reset, but also with practical hunger management. The monk's hunger, you realize, becomes a kind of companion faint, but constant, reminding you of your place in a divine schedule. And there's a strange comfort in that. Hunger here isn't a desperate clawing void. It's a gentle tug, a reminder to stay humble and grateful for each morsel. When you fast for so long, food becomes more than fuel, it becomes a meditation. But what about the work itself? It's often repetitive. Copying religious texts by candlelight, needlework, or gardening. Each task requires focus, patience, and, oddly, helps keep the hunger at bay. The rhythmic scratching of quills, the muted rustle of parchment, or the dirt under your fingernails, these small sensory details fill the spaces between hunger pangs. Some monks even claim their creativity soared on an empty stomach. Maybe it's the same reason some writers today swear by coffee-fueled all-nighters, though here, the fuel is spiritual austerity rather than caffeine. One monk's marginal notes in a 12th century manuscript suggest he found visions and wisdom in fasting's embrace, though modern scholars debate whether that was divine insight or just a mild form of delirium. Outside the scriptorium, the garden is a living classroom for the monks' beliefs about food and fasting. You trudge through rows of herbs and vegetables, carefully tended to provide whatever nourishment is allowed. Parsley, leeks, beans, and wild greens grow under your careful eye, their bitter flavors suited to the monk's modest palate. Oddly, some plants had dual purpose, food and medicine. The monks weren't just fasting eaters. They were early pharmacists. Garlic warded off illnesses. Lavender soothed aches. Elderberry was used to reduce fevers. Their gardens were little pharmacies as well as sources of meals. Historians still argue how much of this knowledge came from Christian teachings, versus older pagan traditions absorbed over centuries. What's clear is that the monks' relationship with plants was intimate, and their diet was shaped by this botanical wisdom as much as by scripture. You glance at a patch of cabbage, a reliable staple of the monastic diet. It's humble, filling, and easy to grow in the chilly cloister soil. The cabbage represents the monk's philosophy. Simple, plain, yet sustaining. It's the perfect food for fasting, nourishing without indulgence. And yet, not all the plants were dull. The monk's recipes sometimes included herbs that brought a faint, pleasant zing: rosemary, sage, thyme sprinkled sparingly to hint at flavor without breaking the fast as austerity. Even these tiny touches were spiritual gestures, transforming meals into humble celebrations. Meanwhile, your hands work the soil, planting seeds that will sprout into next season's meal. The garden's cycles mirror your own: sowing, waiting, harvesting. Each phase a reminder that life, even in fasting, moves forward. You recall a curious medieval practice: the monks' belief that eating bitter greens like chicory or dandelion helped cleanse the spirit. These greens, harsh to your tongue, were thought to battle the internal temptations of gluttony and pride. Modern palates might wince, but the monks considered these bites holy medicine. And so, in this gentle rhythm of work, prayer, and fasting, the monks found a kind of peace. Hunger became part of their spiritual toolkit, not a punishment, but a tool to sharpen their focus and deepen their faith. As the sun begins to lower, you feel the day's hunger fold into a quiet acceptance. The garden smells faintly of earth and hope. The parchment waits for your return. The next meal, simple and awaited, is not far off. And somewhere between the rows of herbs and the quiet prayers, you sense that even in the strictness of fasting, there is a gentle grace, a reminder that simplicity can be its own kind of feast. The evening settles softly over the monastery, and with it comes a time of reflection, both inward and communal. The dining hall, a long stone room lit by flickering candles, is the stage for the final meal before night's silence. You take your place among the monks, the gentle clinking of wooden bowls and spoons, the only soundtrack as you prepare for the evening meal that follows a day of partial fasting. This meal is modest, a humble reward for your restraint. The monks call it collation, a light supper typically consisting of bread, cheese, and perhaps a small portion of cooked vegetables. Unlike the main meal at midday, collation is designed to soothe rather than satisfy. The idea is to nourish the body just enough to prepare for restful sleep, an important consideration since rising early for prayer means waking with a clear, peaceful mind. Historians still debate whether this light evening meal was a genuine aid to sleep or more a symbolic act of moderation, reinforcing monastic discipline. Some argue it prevented monks from overeating at midday, while others think it was a practical adjustment to help with insomnia, an ailment more common among monks than one might guess, especially after long days of fasting. Interestingly, the monks also believed that certain foods eaten in the evening could influence dreams. Herbs like mugwort were sometimes included, thought to encourage pleasant dreams and spiritual visions. The boundaries between diet, health, and mysticism were fluid, and you find yourself wondering what kinds of dreams these monks might have drifted into, perhaps visions inspired by their prayers, or even just maybe the lingering flavors of bitter herbs on their tongues. In the flickering candlelight, the simplicity of the meal brings a strange kind of comfort. The stale bread is rough against your teeth, the cheese faintly sour. You savor each bite slowly, as if prolonging a brief moment of peace in an otherwise rigorous day. The monks' modest evening diet echoes their overall philosophy: restraint wrapped in gratitude. The quiet murmur of prayer soon replaces conversation, the communal silence a shared experience binding everyone together. This is not a time for indulgence, but for connection to faith, to each other, and to the steady rhythm of the monastic life. Food here is less about pleasure and more about purpose. You remember how the monks believed that fasting didn't just cleanse the body, but also sharpen the soul, clearing space for divine insight. Even the smallest meal in the evening was part of this larger spiritual practice, a gentle punctuation in the flow of fasting and prayer. There's a peculiar beauty in this restraint and how hunger is embraced rather than feared. The monks transformed their diets into rituals, and their rituals into acts of devotion. This evening meal is a quiet testament to their commitment, a small but essential piece in the larger mosaic of their daily life. And as you finish the last crumb and sip of water, you notice how the quiet fills the room with a peaceful glow. Outside, the stars begin to twinkle softly, and the monastery feels like a tiny universe suspended between earth and sky. Hunger and fulfillment, night and prayer. You close your eyes briefly, feeling the gentle pull of sleep coming on not from the fullness of a heavy meal, but from the calm acceptance of simple nourishment. Tonight, as every night, the monk's curious dance with fasting and food draws you gently toward rest, a reminder that sometimes less is indeed more. The rhythm of monastic life pulses steadily through the days, each marked by fasting and prayer, labor and rest. But what about the periods between the major fasts? You might imagine monks resting comfortably after their rigors, but knew there was a delicate balance to maintain, a careful calibration between austerity and vitality. In these interludes, monks' diets were surprisingly varied, considering their strict rules. While they avoided meat year-round except for the sick or elderly, they embraced a surprising range of vegetables, grains, and legumes, crafting meals that were filling without being indulgent. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans were staples, often simmered into thick stews that warmed the body on chilly mornings. Historians still argue whether these legumes were a practical choice or a symbolic oneric in protein yet humble in status. They fit the monastic ideal of modest sustenance. These meat substitutes helped keep monks healthy enough for their demanding schedules without breaking the fast's spirit. Interestingly, many monks also experimented with what we'd now call superfoods, wild herbs like nettles and dandelion greens, though bitter, were prized for their medicinal qualities. Some believed that these plants could boost both physical and spiritual health, blurring the line between diet and medicine. Imagine chewing on a bitter leaf while contemplating your place in the universe clearly. Fasting wasn't always a soothing experience. Monks also brewed beer and ale, which might surprise you. Far from being a sinful indulgence, these beverages were often safer than water and provided necessary calories during fasts. Some monasteries became famous for their brewing skills, with recipes passed down and guarded like treasured secrets. The question of alcohol's role in fasting diets is a lively one among scholars. Did monks consume it purely for hydration and calories, or did it carry symbolic meaning in earthly comfort amidst their spiritual journey? No clear consensus yet, but it's fascinating to imagine monks quietly sipping their humble ale, perhaps musing on the irony of fasting while drinking beer. You picture the monks' kitchens bustling with the slow simmering of grains and herbs, the aroma of fresh bread mingling with that of wildflowers from the garden. The preparation itself was part of the ritual, a mindful act connecting food to faith. Food was never just fuel. It was a thread woven into the fabric of daily life, a constant reminder of discipline and devotion. And in the quiet moments between fasts, the monks' diets tell a story of resilience, creativity, and a surprising embrace of nature's bounty. So, while fasting demanded restraint, it also encouraged a nuanced relationship with food, one that balanced need, spirituality, and even occasional pleasure, all within the monastery's austere walls. As the seasons turn, you notice how the monk's diet subtly shifts with the rhythm of the year. Seasonal produce wasn't just a practical matter. It was a spiritual reminder of nature's cycles, a lesson in patience and humility. Imagine waking in early spring, the chill still lingering, and breaking your fast with young greens just peeking through the thawed earth. Medieval monasteries maintained small vegetable gardens, carefully tended to by the brothers themselves. These gardens were modest but diverse: cabbage, leeks, onions, and herbs, like sage and rosemary, filled the beds. Each plant was chosen not only for sustenance, but for its symbolic or medicinal value. For example, the humble leek was prized for its digestive properties, believed to ease the stomach after long fasts. Sage was considered a purifier, a plant that cleansed both body and spirit. You might find monks softly murmuring prayers over their herbs as they worked the soil, infusing their labor with reverence. Historians still debate how much variety these gardens truly provided, given the harsh medieval climate and limited knowledge of agriculture. Some suggest that food scarcity was a constant challenge, making the fasts even more arduous. Others argue monasteries were surprisingly self-sufficient, their careful planning ensuring enough nourishment year-round. When fresh vegetables were scarce, dried legumes and grains came to the rescue, stored carefully in stone cellars. Monks understood preservation techniques that modern eyes might find surprisingly advanced. Pickling, drying, and fermenting extended the life of food far beyond harvest season. The monks' use of fermented foods might seem odd at first. Imagine sipping on sour cabbage or pickled roots after a day of fasting, but these practices provided essential vitamins and aided digestion. Fermentation was a quiet alchemy, turning humble ingredients into life-sustaining fare. Another interesting seasonal shift involved fish, a staple during fast days when meat was forbidden. Monks living near rivers or coasts had access to fresh fish, often salted or smoked for storage. You might picture monks patiently filleting fish by candlelight, the sharp scent mingling with the soft murmurs of prayer. There's a lively debate among scholars about how strictly fish was regulated during fasts. Was it considered a loophole, a kind of permitted indulgence, or simply another form of abstinence? The rules varied by region and order, adding a touch of mystery to the medieval diet. You sense how the monks' connection to the land, the seasons, and their strict rules created a daily rhythm both challenging and deeply grounded. Their diet was a constant lesson in acceptance and adaptation, a reminder that life, even within monastery walls, was never static. As you imagine the garden paths dusted with springtime dew, or the flickering light of the kitchen in late autumn, you feel a subtle comfort in the monks' simple yet profound relationship with food, nature, and faith. You settle into the quiet rhythm of monastic life, and soon notice that despite the strict fasting rules, the monks didn't shy away from occasional culinary creativity. It turns out that, even in the austere walls of the monastery, inventiveness found a way to sneak in through the kitchen door. One of the monks' favorite culinary experiments was the humble padage, thick, slow-cooked stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and herbs were available. Picture a large cauldron simmering gently over the fire, releasing comforting aromas that filled the chilly stone kitchen. Pottage was more than just a basic meal. It was a canvas for experimentation with textures and flavors within strict dietary limits. Some recipes incorporated wild herbs like fennel or lovage to add a subtle complexity. Occasionally, mushrooms, considered a delicacy, were gathered from the surrounding forests, adding an earthy richness to the pot. The monks' pottages varied widely by region and season, reflecting the local environment's offerings. Historians still argue whether pottage was primarily a nutritious staple or a creative outlet for monks seeking small comforts during long fasts. It's intriguing to think that behind the solemn prayers, There might have been whispered debates about how much garlic was too much. Monks also experimented with bread, often dark, dense, and coarse by modern standards. Baking was a precise art, balancing the need to avoid leavened bread during certain fasts with the desire for something filling and satisfying. You can almost hear the rhythmic thump of dough being kneaded, the warmth of the ovens spreading through the monastery. Interestingly, the introduction of spiced bread, infused with cinnamon or anise, added an unexpected sweetness and warmth. These spices were expensive and rare, hinting at the monks' subtle indulgences and connections to the wider medieval trade networks. You might chuckle to imagine monks sneaking a bit of spiced bread under the watchful eyes of the abbey elders, though. Such small rebellions were probably met with knowing smiles more than stern rebukes. The scholarly debate over whether these spices were purely medicinal, symbolic, or indulgent pleasures reflects a broader question about monastic life. Just how boring was their diet? Clearly, the monks found subtle ways to add variety and warmth to their meals without breaking their vows. In this gentle culinary landscape, every meal was a quiet act of balancing, a blend of nourishment, tradition, and the occasional small delight. The kitchen was not just a place of work, but a space where faith and food intertwined with a whisper of humanity. The monastery's diet, while rigid, wasn't without its peculiarities, and of the most curious being the use of honey, nature's liquid gold, as a subtle sweetener and medicine. You imagine monks carefully tending beehives nestled in quiet corners of the abbey grounds, their gentle buzzing a soft backdrop to daily prayers. Honey was highly prized, not only for its sweetness, but also for its preservative and healing qualities. While refined sugar was rare and expensive, honey served as the primary sweetening agent in recipes and medicinal concoctions. Picture a monk slowly stirring honey into a bitter herbal tonic, wincing but hopeful for relief. Historians still argue how frequently honey was used in fasting diets. Was it a necessary supplement, a permitted indulgence, or something more symbolic? Some monasteries amassed significant honey stores, while others seemed to use it sparingly, making it a valuable commodity. You might smile at the idea that honey, with its sticky sweetness, was the monk's version of a treat, a gentle reminder that fasting didn't mean complete deprivation. The contrast between austerity and the soft indulgence of honey captures the nuanced dance of monastic food culture. Another fascinating ingredient was vinegar, often made from apples or wine. Its sharp tang might seem an odd choice for monks, but vinegar served multiple purposes: a preservative, a digestive aid, and a flavor enhancer. You can almost hear the quiet clink of earthenware jars as vinegar was measured into pottages or diluted into drinking water. The debate among scholars about vinegar's role in monastic diets reflects larger questions about medieval medicine and nutrition. Was it primarily practical, or did it carry spiritual symbolism of purification? You picture the monks gathering around the refectory table, dipping bread into vinegar or drizzling honey over their modest for each bite, a small celebration of life's simple pleasures amid strict discipline. Their diets, you realize, were a delicate balance of austerity, health, and occasional sweetness, underscored by an intimate knowledge of the natural world and its gifts. And so, as you imagine the soft glow of candlelight flickering over stone walls, you sense how food in the monastery was more than sustenance. It was a quiet meditation, a ritual woven into every waking moment. As you near the end of this long journey through the monk's curious diet, you begin to see the subtle patterns that emerge: a life carefully measured, where food was both a necessity and a reminder of spiritual goals. Their fasting wasn't about starvation, but about rhythm and restraint, a slow dance with hunger that shaped their days and nights. Despite the austerity, their diet was surprisingly rich in variety and intention. From the spring greens and preserved legumes to the sweet kiss of honey and the sharpness of vinegar, every bite carried layers of meaning and history. Imagine sitting quietly in the refectory, the soft murmur of chanting brothers, blending with the gentle clinking of utensils, a scene both serene and profoundly human. Historians still debate the overall impact of such prolonged fasting on health and spirituality. But one thing is clear: these monks lived their beliefs deeply, their meals acting as daily rituals of discipline and gratitude. You can almost hear their quiet footsteps in cloisters, the rustle of robes, the faint scent of herbs and wood smoke mingling in the cool air. Your mind drifts back to the slow simmering pottage, the garden's fresh bounty, the hidden sweetness of honey-act detail, a whisper from a distant past that, strangely, feels close and comforting. And as you lay back, you feel the peaceful weight of centuries settle softly around you, a lullaby sung by the ghosts of those who lived by rhythm, reverence, and the curious dance of fasting and feasting. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let these gentle stories guide you into a calm, restful sleep. The kitchen fires have cooled, the monastery has grown still, and the stories you've heard begin to fade like the last glow of twilight. Imagine the quiet stone halls, where echoes of whispered prayers settle into the silence, wrapping the space in a gentle embrace. Your breathing slows, steady and calm, like the monk's own measured rhythm. There's comfort in routine, in knowing that even centuries ago, people sought peace through simple acts: the planting of a seed, the stirring of a pot, the quiet sharing of a meal. The monk's lives remind us that sometimes slowing down is its own kind of nourishment. As your eyes grow heavy, picture the soft touch of morning light through stained glass, the faint rustle of leaves in a monastery garden, and the distant melody of a bell calling the faithful to rest. Let this imagery soften your thoughts, ease your mind, and carry you gently towards sleep. Rest well, knowing that you've walked beside those who found holiness in the ordinary, beauty in restraint, and peace in the simplest of daily rituals. Sweet dreams.